The sound of Commander Jackson Reed's wrist snapping echoed across the training grounds like a thunderclap, instantly silencing 500 Marines assembled at Fort Meridian in complete, stunned disbelief. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood motionless in her crisp dress blues, her auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, her hands still positioned in the textbook defensive stance she'd perfected years ago during her specialized combat training with elite military units. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of the shocked witnesses knew as they watched their respected base commander crumple to his knees, howling in excruciating pain while cradling his mangled arm, was that this 29-year-old intelligence officer wasn't remotely who she'd claimed to be for the past 8 months, and this single moment of justified self-defense had just shattered a carefully orchestrated web of lies that reached far deeper than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just about one man's wounded ego or a split-second defensive reaction. What was about to unfold would expose a systematic pattern of corruption, abuse, and cover-ups that had poisoned the entire command structure at one of America's most prestigious military installations. A criminal conspiracy that had been allowed to fester for years, protected by a code of silence and institutional loyalty that valued reputation over justice. Before we dive into this extraordinary true story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about military honor and accountability, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories of courage against impossible odds inspire you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover will change how you think about standing up to power forever. 8 months earlier, Sarah Mitchell had walked through the gates of Fort Meridian with a meticulously constructed false identity and a classified mission that could make or break careers at the highest levels of military command. The Department of Defense Inspector General's office had embedded her deep undercover as a junior intelligence officer after receiving a disturbing series of anonymous whistleblower reports about Commander Reed's leadership. The allegations were explosive and wide-ranging: systematic sexual harassment of female personnel, financial irregularities in multi-million-dollar defense contracts, witness intimidation of anyone who dared speak up, and the creation of a toxic command climate where fear ruled over honor. But the accusations were also carefully orchestrated to avoid creating paper trails, making traditional investigations nearly impossible without someone on the inside who could observe and document the daily reality behind closed doors. Sarah had volunteered for this assignment despite knowing it would require her to live a complete lie for months, potentially putting herself in serious danger while surrounded by people who could end her career with a single phone call if her true identity was discovered. Her cover story was bulletproof. Captain Sarah Mitchell, transferred from Naval Intelligence Command in Norfolk, specializing in tactical analysis with an unremarkable service record that wouldn't attract unwanted attention or raise suspicions about her background. She moved into the junior officers' quarters with minimal personal belongings, established routines that matched her supposed role, and began the painstaking process of integration into the tight-knit community at Fort Meridian. Her appearance was deliberately understated. Auburn hair always in regulation style, uniforms properly maintained but not obsessively perfect, and a professional demeanor that suggested competence without exceptional ambition. Every detail was calculated to make her appear like just another capable officer doing her job. The reality beneath this carefully crafted persona was far more complex and dangerous. Sarah had spent 12 years in military intelligence before accepting this assignment, working on cases that ranged from international espionage to domestic terrorism within military communities. Her specialized training included advanced psychological operations, surveillance techniques, and extensive close-quarters combat instruction from Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a decorated veteran who'd spent 25 years teaching military personnel how to survive life-threatening confrontations. Those combat skills had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of hours of intensive training, creating reflexive responses that activated without conscious thought when genuine threats presented themselves. Sarah had hoped she'd never need to use those skills in this assignment, but the training that made her capable of defending herself would ultimately become the catalyst that exposed everything. Her handler for this sensitive operation was Lieutenant Colonel David Morgan, a 20-year veteran of military intelligence with sharp instincts and deep understanding that successful undercover operations required extraordinary patience and meticulous documentation rather than dramatic confrontations that could compromise months of careful work. They maintained contact through carefully orchestrated meetings disguised as routine professional interactions, sometimes at the officers' club where casual conversation could include coded updates on her progress, other times at neutral locations off base, where civilians and military personnel mixed freely enough that their discussions would attract no particular attention. The first month at Fort Meridian had been dedicated to establishing her cover identity while conducting preliminary observations of the command structure and identifying key personnel who might possess crucial information about the allegations that had triggered this investigation. Sarah worked in the intelligence analysis section of Building 7, processing threat assessments and managing classified databases with exactly the level of competence expected from her supposed rank and experience. Her colleagues were professionally cordial, though the natural reserve that greeted any new officer actually served her purposes well by creating appropriate distance while she conducted her real mission. Commander Jackson Reed controlled Fort Meridian with the absolute confidence of someone who'd spent 28 years in the military and genuinely believed his rank and experience placed him beyond questioning or accountability. At 51, he maintained the physical fitness standards expected of senior officers, though years of high-stress command positions and multiple combat deployments had left visible marks on his weathered face and increasingly volatile temperament. Reed had built his reputation through aggressive leadership during deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, earning commendations for decisive action under pressure and building a network of loyal subordinates who viewed him as the embodiment of traditional military values. That reputation provided perfect cover for behavior that had grown increasingly problematic during his 4 years commanding Fort Meridian, creating an environment where questioning his judgment was treated as disloyalty rather than appropriate professional oversight. What none of the 500 Marines witnessing this moment could have anticipated was that everything they thought they knew about their base, their commander, and the quiet intelligence officer who'd just defended herself was about to be turned completely upside down. The investigation that followed would reveal corruption so extensive and systematic that it would trigger congressional hearings, result in multiple criminal prosecutions, and fundamentally change how the military handles allegations of command misconduct. But it all started with one moment of violence, one reflexive defensive action, and the sound of breaking bone that would echo far beyond the training grounds of Fort Meridian. As the medics rushed to load Commander Reed onto a stretcher, his anguished screams still echoing across the training grounds, the 500 Marines remained frozen in formation, their faces displaying a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else, something that looked almost like relief. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood exactly where the confrontation had occurred, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, but her mind was racing through calculations about how this single moment had just obliterated 8 months of meticulous undercover work. What the assembled Marines didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, as they watched their seemingly unremarkable intelligence officer maintain perfect military bearing while their base commander was wheeled away, screaming, was that they had just witnessed the collision of two entirely different realities. The carefully constructed facade that had protected Fort Meridian's darkest secrets was about to crumble, and the quiet officer they thought they knew was actually the instrument of that destruction. The truth about Captain Sarah Mitchell was so far removed from her cover identity that even seasoned military investigators would later struggle to reconcile the deception with the person they thought they'd been working alongside for months. She wasn't simply a different rank or from a different unit. She was operating under a completely fabricated identity, with forged service records, manufactured personal history, and a mission that had been classified at levels most of the personnel at Fort Meridian didn't even know existed. But the deception ran deeper than just Sarah's identity. The entire incident that had just unfolded, Reed's unprovoked attack during what should have been a routine formation inspection, Sarah's lightning-fast defensive response that had shattered bone with surgical precision, and the stunned silence of 500 witnesses, was actually the inevitable conclusion of a criminal conspiracy that had been festering at Fort Meridian for years. Major Rebecca Torres, Reed's executive officer, stood among the senior staff watching the medics work, her face carefully composed in an expression of professional concern. But behind her controlled demeanor, Rebecca's mind was frantically calculating how this incident would affect the delicate balance of secrets, favors, and mutual protection that had kept Reed's operation running smoothly for so long. She'd spent 3 years as Reed's right hand, implementing his directives and managing the complex web of relationships that allowed certain activities to occur without official documentation or oversight. What Rebecca didn't know, what none of Reed's inner circle could have suspected, was that every conversation she'd had with the unassuming intelligence officer over the past 8 months had been carefully documented. Every casual comment about command policies had been analyzed for evidence, and every glimpse into the base's real operations had been reported through encrypted channels to investigators who were building a comprehensive case against the entire command structure. Sergeant First Class Amanda Rodriguez had been among the formation witnesses, standing close enough to see the exact sequence of events that led to Reed's injury. As a 12-year veteran with experience in multiple commands, Amanda had developed sharp instincts about leadership and military politics. Something about the way Captain Mitchell had responded, not just the physical technique, but her immediate composure afterward and the complete absence of surprise or panic, suggested training and experience that went far beyond what intelligence analysts typically received. Amanda had also noticed things about Mitchell over the past months that hadn't quite added up. The way she asked questions that seemed designed to elicit specific information rather than simply gathering routine intelligence. Her unusual interest in personnel policies and command procedures that weren't directly related to her supposed analytical responsibilities. The careful way she interacted with different groups of personnel as though she was mapping relationships and influence patterns rather than simply being social. Most telling had been Mitchell's response to the increasingly tense command climate that had developed over recent months. While other junior officers had grown visibly uncomfortable with Reed's erratic behavior and harsh treatment of subordinates, Mitchell had observed everything with a kind of professional detachment that suggested she was documenting rather than experiencing the toxic environment. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson had served directly under Reed for 2 years and had witnessed behavior that troubled him deeply, but that he'd never felt able to report through official channels. Reed's treatment of female personnel had been particularly concerning, involving comments and attention that crossed professional boundaries while remaining just ambiguous enough to avoid clear violations that could be formally documented. Thompson had tried to shield some of the younger Marines from Reed's attention, but his efforts were limited by rank and position. What Thompson couldn't have known was that every incident he'd witnessed and worried about had also been observed and meticulously documented by someone with the authority and mission to turn those observations into actionable evidence. Mitchell hadn't just been present during Reed's inappropriate interactions, she'd been recording them, analyzing patterns, and building cases that would eventually result in criminal charges. The financial irregularities that had triggered the initial investigation were equally well concealed beneath layers of legitimate paperwork and established procurement procedures. Reed had cultivated relationships with defense contractors who provided services to Fort Meridian, steering multi-million-dollar contracts to companies that reciprocated with personal benefits disguised as consulting fees, speaking engagements, and investment opportunities that appeared entirely legal on paper. Captain James Bradford managed procurement operations for the base and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with pressure to expedite certain contracts without following standard competitive bidding procedures. Reed had made clear that efficiency and maintaining good relationships with reliable contractors were more important than rigid adherence to bureaucratic processes that delayed essential services. Bradford had complied with these directives while documenting his concerns through appropriate channels, but those reports had somehow never resulted in any meaningful review or changes to procedures. What Bradford hadn't realized was that his carefully documented concerns had actually reached exactly the right people, investigators who'd used his reports as part of the foundation for launching this comprehensive undercover operation. Every contract irregularity he'd noted, every pressure he'd felt to circumvent normal procedures, and every suspicious transaction he'd processed had been pieces of a larger puzzle that was now nearly complete. The code of silence that protected Reed's operation wasn't maintained through explicit threats or obvious intimidation. Instead, it relied on the military culture of loyalty, hierarchy, and institutional reputation that made questioning senior leadership seem like betrayal rather than appropriate oversight. Personnel who'd witnessed concerning behavior convinced themselves that they must be misunderstanding the situation, that their concerns were overblown, or that reporting problems would damage the unit's reputation and effectiveness. Dr. Patricia Williams, the base psychologist, had noticed increased stress and anxiety among personnel reporting to Reed's command, but professional ethics prevented her from discussing specific cases or raising concerns without clear evidence of policy violations. She'd documented patterns in her aggregate reports about command climate, but those observations had been buried in bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to minimize rather than address institutional problems. The truly devastating secret that none of Reed's loyalists suspected was that this entire investigation had been triggered not by external complaints or routine audits, but by evidence gathered through a completely separate criminal investigation involving defense contractor fraud that had uncovered Reed's financial activities almost by accident. The military investigators who discovered Reed's involvement in contract manipulation had realized they'd stumbled onto something much larger and more systematic than simple financial misconduct. As formation was dismissed and personnel began dispersing from the training grounds, conversations erupted throughout Fort Meridian about what they'd just witnessed. Some focused on the shocking violence of the incident, the sound of breaking bone and Reed's screams of agony. Others speculated about what could have prompted their usually controlled commander to attempt striking a subordinate officer in full view of 500 witnesses. but the most perceptive observers were beginning to ask different questions. Why had Captain Mitchell's defensive response been so precisely executed and devastatingly effective? Why did she seem completely unshaken by having seriously injured a superior officer? And why did something about her entire demeanor suggest that this incident, shocking as it appeared, was actually part of a larger story that none of them fully understood yet? The answers to those questions would reshape everything they thought they knew about their base, their leadership, and the nature of justice in military institutions. But first, they'd have to learn that the quiet intelligence officer they'd worked alongside for 8 months was actually someone else entirely, and that her real mission at Fort Meridian was about to turn their world completely upside down. 8 months earlier, Sarah Mitchell had received the assignment that would define her career during a classified briefing in a windowless conference room buried 3 floors beneath the Pentagon. Lieutenant Colonel David Morgan had laid out surveillance photographs, financial records, and whistleblower testimonies across the polished table with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades building cases against people who believed themselves untouchable. Fort Meridian represents everything wrong with our current oversight systems, Morgan had explained, his voice carrying the weight of institutional frustration built up over years of watching obvious problems get buried under layers of bureaucracy and institutional loyalty. We have credible allegations spanning financial fraud, sexual misconduct, witness intimidation, and systematic abuse of command authority. But every traditional investigation has been stonewalled by a combination of missing documentation, uncooperative witnesses, and command structures that prioritize reputation over accountability. The evidence spread before Sarah painted a disturbing picture of institutional corruption that had metastasized over years of ineffective oversight. Anonymous reports from personnel described a command climate where questioning authority was treated as treason, where female Marines learned to avoid certain areas and situations, and where financial irregularities were explained away as operational necessities rather than investigated as potential crimes. Commander Jackson Reed has been running Fort Meridian like his personal kingdom for 4 years, Morgan continued, pointing to organizational charts that showed the tight network of loyalists Reed had positioned throughout key administrative and operational roles. Every conventional investigation has failed because witnesses are too afraid to cooperate. Documentation mysteriously disappears, and the people responsible for oversight are either complicit or compromised. The Inspector General's office had tried standard approaches multiple times, sending teams to conduct interviews and review procedures, but each investigation had been expertly managed by Reed's organization. Personnel gave carefully scripted responses that acknowledged no problems beyond normal operational challenges. Financial records were produced that appeared to comply with all relevant regulations, though careful analysis revealed suspicious patterns that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify actual transactions. We need someone inside who can observe daily operations, document actual practices rather than official procedures, and build relationships that might eventually convince witnesses to provide truthful testimony, Morgan had explained. This assignment requires someone with extensive investigative experience, advanced training in personal security, and the psychological resilience to maintain false identity under sustained pressure for extended periods. Sarah had been selected for this mission based on her unique combination of qualifications and personal characteristics that made her ideal for deep undercover work. Her 12 years in military intelligence had included assignments that required extended deception and careful cultivation of sources in hostile environments. Her advanced combat training provided security capabilities that might prove essential if her cover was compromised in dangerous circumstances. Most importantly, her psychological profile indicated exceptional ability to compartmentalize stress and maintain operational focus, even under extreme pressure. The cover identity created for Sarah was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction that would withstand all but the most intensive scrutiny. Captain Sarah Mitchell's service record included assignments at 3 different installations, performance evaluations that were consistently good but not exceptional, and personal background that explained her transfer to Fort Meridian as routine career progression rather than anything that might attract special attention. Her fictional educational background included degrees from state universities that produced thousands of military officers, making her credentials unremarkable but appropriately qualified for intelligence analysis positions. Her supposed family history included deceased parents and minimal extended family, reducing the number of personal connections that might require ongoing deception. Even her medical records had been carefully crafted to show standard military health history without any conditions or treatments that might prompt questions. The physical preparation for this assignment had been as intensive as the bureaucratic documentation. Sarah spent 6 weeks at a classified facility in Virginia, working with specialists who taught her to modify her mannerisms, speech patterns, and personal habits to match her cover identity. She practiced answering hundreds of potential questions about her fictional background until the responses became automatic and natural. Rather than memorized scripts, military trainers worked with her to adjust her bearing and movement patterns to match someone with her supposed experience rather than her actual specialized training. Intelligence analysts coached her on the technical aspects of the work she'd be performing, ensuring she could competently execute the duties of her cover position while conducting her real mission of observation and evidence gathering. The mission parameters were clearly defined but left considerable discretion about specific methods and approaches. Sarah's primary objectives included documenting Reed's behavior patterns and decision-making processes, identifying personnel who might possess relevant information about alleged misconduct, mapping the organizational relationships that enabled problematic activities, and gathering evidence about financial irregularities that could support criminal prosecution. She was explicitly instructed to avoid any actions that might compromise her cover or create unnecessary risks to herself or potential witnesses. The investigation's success depended on patience, careful observation, and gradual relationship building, rather than dramatic confrontations or aggressive evidence gathering that might alert targets to the investigation. "Your safety is the absolute priority," Morgan had emphasized. "If situations develop that threaten your cover or personal security, extraction protocols can be activated immediately. This investigation matters, but not more than your life or well-being. The communication protocols established for the mission balanced operational security with the need for regular updates and guidance from supervisory personnel." Sarah would maintain contact with Morgan through carefully structured meetings disguised as routine professional interactions, supplemented by encrypted digital communications that appeared to be standard administrative correspondence between intelligence units. Emergency extraction procedures were established that could remove Sarah from Fort Meridian within hours if circumstances required immediate departure. Multiple cover stories were prepared to explain sudden reassignment or medical emergency that might necessitate her urgent transfer to another location without raising suspicions about the real reasons for her departure. The psychological preparation for sustained undercover work included extensive counseling about the emotional toll of living false identity for extended periods. Sarah worked with specialists who'd supported other long-term undercover operations, learning techniques for maintaining psychological stability while managing the stress of constant deception and potential danger. The hardest part isn't remembering your cover story or performing your duties. One experienced undercover officer had explained during her preparation, it's maintaining your sense of self when every interaction requires you to be someone else. You'll make genuine connections with people you're simultaneously deceiving, and you'll observe behavior that you want to address immediately but must document patiently instead. The mission timeline was deliberately flexible, with success measured by quality of evidence rather than speed of completion. Initial estimates suggested 6 to 12 months might be required to establish sufficient relationships and gather adequate documentation to support prosecution, but the actual duration would depend on circumstances that couldn't be predicted from outside Fort Meridian. Financial resources were allocated to support the operation for up to 2 years if necessary, with specialized equipment and technical support available as needed. Sarah would have access to advanced surveillance technology, secure communication systems, and expert consultation on legal and procedural issues that might arise during the investigation. The broader institutional context made this mission particularly important beyond just addressing problems at Fort Meridian. Military leadership recognized that systematic command failures at major installations could undermine public confidence in military institutions and compromise national security if left uncorrected. Successful prosecution of senior officers who'd abused their authority would send clear messages about accountability expectations throughout the service. As Sarah had driven toward Fort Meridian that first day 8 months ago, she'd understood that she was embarking on an assignment that could make or break careers at the highest levels of military leadership. The evidence she gathered would either expose criminal behavior that demanded prosecution or prove that allegations against Reed were unfounded and restore confidence in his leadership. What she hadn't anticipated was how personal the mission would become, how the relationships she'd forge and the behavior she'd witness would affect her own understanding of military institutions and her career within them. The investigation that had begun as a professional assignment was about to become something much more complex and personally challenging than any training could have prepared her for. Sarah's arrival at Fort Meridian on that crisp October morning had been orchestrated to appear as unremarkable as possible. She drove through the main gate in a modest sedan with Virginia plates, her belongings packed in standard military-issue duffel bags that suggested a routine transfer rather than anything requiring special attention. The gate guards processed her credentials with professional efficiency, their cursory review of her orders revealing nothing unusual about Captain Sarah Mitchell's assignment to the Intelligence Analysis Section. Her first stop was the Personnel Processing Center in Building 12, where Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh handled routine in-processing for newly assigned officers. Walsh was a 15-year veteran with sharp eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of Fort Meridian's personnel and operations, making her someone Sarah needed to convince completely while avoiding any interactions that might seem overly curious about base operations or command structure. "Welcome to Fort Meridian, Captain," Walsh had said, reviewing the transfer orders that represented months of careful preparation by intelligence specialists who understood exactly which bureaucratic details needed to be perfect to withstand scrutiny. "Your temporary quarters are in Building 18, 3rd floor. You'll want to check in with Major Torres in the morning for your initial briefing with the Intelligence Section." Sarah's quarters were deliberately modest, a small apartment with basic furnishings that matched what junior officers typically received during routine assignments. She unpacked carefully, arranging personal items that had been selected to create the impression of someone with conventional interests and unremarkable personal history. Photographs of fictional family members, books that suggested intellectual curiosity without unusual specializations, and clothing that reflected appropriate taste without drawing attention to quality or expense that might seem inconsistent with military pay. The next morning, she reported to Building 7 for her first meeting with Major Rebecca Torres, Commander Reed's executive officer and the person responsible for managing day-to-day operations of the intelligence section. Torres was 42, with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd built her career on attention to detail and absolute loyalty to her commanding officer. Her office was meticulously organized, with operational charts and personnel rosters that provided Sarah her first glimpse into the command structure she'd be navigating for the next several months. "Captain Mitchell, your background in tactical analysis will be valuable here," Torres had explained, reviewing Sarah's fictional service record with apparent satisfaction. "We handle threat assessments for the entire southeastern region, which means managing classified information from multiple agencies and maintaining security protocols that are more stringent than what you might have experienced at previous assignments." The briefing covered standard operational procedures, security requirements, and administrative policies that Sarah absorbed while simultaneously analyzing Torres's demeanor and speech patterns for insights into the command climate. Torres projected confidence and competence, but Sarah noticed subtle tensions when discussing certain personnel policies and budget procedures that suggested underlying stress about topics that should have been routine. Sarah's assigned workspace was in a secure area of Building 7 that housed the intelligence analysis team, where she'd be working alongside 8 other officers and senior enlisted personnel responsible for processing and analyzing classified information. Her cubicle was positioned where she could observe interactions between personnel while appearing to focus on her assigned duties, providing perfect cover for the observation and relationship building that were her real mission. Captain Ryan O'Connor occupied the adjacent workspace and had been assigned as Sarah's initial mentor for acclimating to Fort Meridian's specific procedures and protocols. O'Connor was 28, intelligent and professionally competent, but Sarah detected signs of stress and discomfort that suggested he might possess information about problems within the command structure. His careful way of discussing certain procedures and his subtle warnings about various personnel indicated someone who'd learned to navigate a complex political environment. "The work here is straightforward if you follow the established procedures," O'Connor had explained during her first week, his tone suggesting layers of meaning beyond the literal words. "Major Torres expects precise compliance with all directives, and Commander Reed takes personal interest in ensuring our analysis meets his standards. It's important to understand the expectations and work within the established frameworks." Sarah's cover duties involved analyzing intelligence reports about potential security threats in the region, work that was genuinely important but provided excellent cover for her real mission of observing base operations and personnel interactions. She could legitimately request access to various databases and communicate with personnel throughout the installation while appearing to conduct routine intelligence analysis rather than conducting surveillance of her colleagues. Her daily routine was carefully crafted to maximize opportunities for observation while maintaining the appearance of a dedicated officer focused on her assigned responsibilities. She arrived early enough to observe personnel interactions during the less formal morning period, took lunch at the main dining facility, where conversations were more casual and revealing, and participated in required physical training sessions, where social dynamics often became more apparent. The physical training sessions proved particularly valuable for understanding the base's social hierarchy and identifying personnel who might be experiencing stress related to command climate issues. Sarah observed how different groups of Marines interacted, who seemed comfortable and confident versus who appeared tense or withdrawn, and which personnel seemed to command respect versus fear from their subordinates. Lieutenant Amanda Foster was among the personnel Sarah identified as potentially valuable sources of information about command operations. Foster was 26, relatively new to Fort Meridian, but experienced enough to recognize when procedures deviated from standard military practices. During casual conversations after training sessions, Sarah detected that Foster had observed things that troubled her, but wasn't sure how to address through official channels. "Sometimes I feel like there are two different sets of rules here," Foster had mentioned during one conversation, her voice carefully modulated to avoid being overheard by other personnel. "What we're told in briefings doesn't always match what actually happens in practice, but questioning procedures isn't really encouraged here." Sarah's approach to building relationships required extraordinary patience and psychological sophistication. She needed to appear genuinely interested in her colleagues as people, while secretly analyzing every interaction for investigative value. She had to remember details about fictional personal history while simultaneously gathering and organizing real intelligence about the personnel and operations she was investigating. Her training in psychological operations proved invaluable for managing these complex social dynamics. She understood how to ask questions that seemed casual but elicited specific information, how to express sympathy and understanding that encouraged people to confide in her, and how to maintain friendships based on systematic deception without compromising either her cover or her mission objectives. The most challenging aspect of the infiltration phase was managing her own emotional responses to the behavior she began observing within weeks of her arrival. Commander Reed's interactions with female personnel were clearly inappropriate, involving comments and attention that crossed professional boundaries while remaining just ambiguous enough to avoid obvious policy violations. His treatment of subordinates who questioned procedures or raised concerns was harsh enough to create a climate of fear without involving explicit threats that could be formally documented. Sarah had to watch colleagues experience harassment and intimidation while maintaining her cover and building cases rather than intervening immediately. The psychological toll of sustained observation without action was more difficult than her training had prepared her for, requiring constant reminders that long-term justice required short-term patience and careful evidence gathering. Her secure communications with Lieutenant Colonel Morgan provided essential support during this phase, allowing her to report observations and receive guidance about investigative priorities while maintaining strict operational security. Morgan's experience with similar operations helped Sarah navigate the emotional challenges of undercover work, while ensuring her mission remained focused on gathering actionable evidence rather than getting distracted by immediate concerns that might compromise the broader investigation. The gradual process of integration into Fort Meridian's community provided Sarah access to information and relationships that would prove crucial for exposing the full scope of Reed's misconduct, but it also created personal connections and moral obligations that complicated her role as an undercover investigator in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The first month at Fort Meridian proved to be a masterclass in institutional dysfunction disguised as military efficiency. Sarah's position in the intelligence analysis section provided her with legitimate access to personnel records, operational reports, and administrative communications that revealed disturbing patterns beneath the surface of routine military operations. What appeared to be a well-functioning command when viewed from outside began showing cracks and inconsistencies that suggested systematic problems with leadership and accountability. Her daily work involved analyzing threat assessments and intelligence reports that required coordination with various departments throughout the base, creating natural opportunities to observe how different sections operated and how personnel interacted across organizational boundaries. Sarah quickly noticed that certain departments seemed to function with unusual autonomy, processing requests and handling procedures without the standard oversight and documentation that characterized military operations. The procurement section, managed by Captain James Bradford, operated under directives that seemed to prioritize speed and flexibility over the competitive bidding and documentation requirements that normally governed military contracts. Sarah observed Bradford processing purchase orders and vendor payments that bypassed standard approval chains, with authorization coming directly from Commander Reed's office through informal communications rather than official procurement channels. During her second week, Sarah attended a staff meeting where Major Torres briefed section leaders about operational priorities and budget allocations for the upcoming quarter. The meeting itself was professional and routine, but Sarah noticed significant discrepancies between the financial figures Torres presented and the budget documents she'd reviewed as part of her cover duties analyzing base expenditures for security assessment purposes. Captain Bradford, your section has been exceptionally efficient in managing vendor relationships and maintaining operational readiness, Torres had announced during the meeting. Commander Reed specifically commends your ability to cut through bureaucratic delays and ensure our contractors can provide timely service without getting bogged down in administrative complications. The praise seemed routine, but Sarah detected subtle discomfort in Bradford's response and noted that several other section leaders exchanged glances that suggested they understood implications beyond Torres's literal words. After the meeting, she made casual inquiries about procurement procedures that revealed widespread awareness among personnel that certain contracts were handled through expedited processes that weren't available to all vendors. Sarah's analysis of personnel records revealed patterns that raised serious concerns about how assignments and evaluations were determined within Reed's command. Female Marines who'd filed any type of complaint through official channels, even routine grievances about working conditions or equipment issues, consistently received negative performance evaluations and were transferred to less desirable positions within months of their complaints. Lieutenant Amanda Foster had been transferred from a prestigious assignment with the intelligence analysis team to routine administrative duties after questioning discrepancies in classified material handling procedures. Her transfer orders cited performance concerns and attitude issues, but Sarah's review of Foster's actual work product showed consistently high-quality analysis and no documented instances of inappropriate behavior or poor performance. I thought I was doing my job by pointing out that certain classified documents weren't being logged properly according to security regulations, Foster confided to Sarah during a conversation at the base gym. But apparently asking questions about procedures means you're not a team player. Major Torres made it clear that my concerns were noted and that I should focus on following directives rather than analyzing whether those directives comply with regulations. The pattern of retaliation against personnel who raised concerns extended beyond female Marines to include anyone who seemed to question command decisions or suggest that procedures might need improvement. Sergeant First Class David Kim had been demoted after submitting a report about safety violations in equipment maintenance procedures despite the fact that his report had identified legitimate problems that posed risks to personnel safety. Kim's demotion had been justified through a sudden performance review that cited failure to maintain proper respect for chain of command and tendency to create problems rather than solve them. The administrative language was carefully crafted to appear legitimate while clearly serving as punishment for raising inconvenient concerns about operational procedures. Sarah's observation of Commander Reed's daily interactions with personnel provided disturbing insights into his leadership style and personal behavior. During formation inspections and administrative meetings, Reed displayed a pattern of inappropriate attention toward female Marines that involved prolonged visual examination, personal comments that had no professional relevance, and questions about their personal lives that seemed designed to gather information about their availability and social situations. His interactions with Lieutenant Christina Hayes were particularly concerning. Hayes was 24, professionally competent, and had recently arrived at Fort Meridian from a previous assignment where she'd received exceptional performance evaluations. Reed's attention toward Hayes escalated over Sarah's first month of observation, progressing from occasional comments about her appearance during uniform inspections to more frequent individual meetings that seemed to have no clear professional purpose. "Commander Reed has been very interested in helping me adjust to Fort Meridian," Hayes mentioned to Sarah during a conversation that revealed both discomfort and uncertainty about how to interpret Reed's attention. "He's scheduled several individual mentoring sessions to discuss my career goals and make sure I'm receiving appropriate guidance. It's unusual to receive so much personal attention from the base commander, but I suppose he takes special interest in ensuring junior officers are properly supported." Sarah recognized the classic patterns of grooming behavior in Reed's approach to Hayes, establishing special relationships, creating obligations through supposed mentoring, and gradually increasing personal attention while maintaining plausible professional justification for the interactions. Hayes's uncertainty about whether the attention was appropriate reflected the skill with which Reed operated within gray areas that made formal complaints difficult to justify. The financial irregularities Sarah documented during her first month exceeded what the initial investigation had suspected. Her analysis of procurement records revealed that 3 specific contractors, Meridian Solutions, LLC, Tactical Services Group, and Operational Support Partners, had received contracts totaling $4.2 million over the past 18 months, without competing bids and with approval processes that bypassed normal oversight mechanisms. The contracts themselves appeared legitimate on paper, involving services like facility maintenance, security consulting, and equipment upgrades that were routine requirements for military installations. However, the pricing for these services was significantly higher than comparable contracts at similar bases, and the work performed didn't seem to justify the premium costs being paid. Sarah's research into the ownership of these contracting companies revealed complex corporate structures that obscured actual ownership and control, but careful analysis of business registration documents and financial filings suggested connections to personal associates of Commander Reed. Meridian Solutions was registered to Marcus Thompson, who'd served under Reed during a previous deployment and maintained social relationships with Reed's family through various civilian activities. The pattern of financial relationships extended beyond direct contracts to include consulting agreements, speaking fees, and investment opportunities that provided Reed with personal income streams that appeared to be connected to his official decisions about contractor selection and contract terms. The amounts involved weren't enormous by military standards, but they represented systematic corruption that violated numerous regulations and potentially criminal statutes. Sarah's secure communications with Lieutenant Colonel Morgan during her first month focused on documenting these patterns and identifying the personnel who might possess additional information about the scope of Reed's activities. Morgan's guidance emphasized the importance of building comprehensive cases rather than pursuing quick arrests that might miss the full extent of the corruption or allow other participants to destroy evidence. What you're documenting confirms our worst suspicions about systematic abuse of authority, Morgan had told Sarah during one of their carefully orchestrated meetings at a coffee shop off base. But we need to understand the full network of people who've enabled or participated in these activities before. We move to prosecution. Reed couldn't operate this way without cooperation from multiple personnel at different levels of the command structure. The psychological toll of documenting systematic misconduct while maintaining friendly relationships with colleagues who might be victims, perpetrators, or enablers was more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. She found herself analyzing every interaction for investigative value while simultaneously managing genuine emotional responses to the behavior she was witnessing and the people she was getting to know as individuals rather than just sources of information. Her training had prepared her for the operational aspects of undercover work, but the personal complexities of living among people she was investigating while watching them experience harassment and intimidation created emotional burdens that required constant management to avoid compromising her mission or her psychological well-being. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By her second month at Fort Meridian, Sarah had begun documenting a web of misconduct that extended far beyond Commander Reed's personal behavior into systematic institutional failures that had created an environment where abuse flourished unchecked. The evidence she gathered painted a picture of corruption so pervasive that multiple personnel at various levels had either participated directly or enabled the misconduct through willful blindness and misplaced loyalty. The harassment of female personnel had escalated beyond inappropriate comments and unwanted attention into explicit quid pro quo arrangements where career advancement became contingent on tolerating or participating in Reed's demands. Lieutenant Christina Hayes had confided to Sarah that Reed's mentoring sessions had progressed to dinner invitations at off-base restaurants, with increasingly personal conversations about her relationship status and social activities outside of work. He keeps emphasizing how important it is for junior officers to understand that success in the military depends on building the right relationships with senior leadership, Hayes had explained during a conversation that revealed her growing discomfort with Reed's escalating attention. He's made it clear that my next assignment and promotion opportunities will depend on demonstrating appropriate loyalty and willingness to go above and beyond normal duty requirements. Sarah recognized the classic language of sexual coercion disguised as professional mentorship, but Hayes's position as a direct subordinate of Reed made formal complaints extremely risky, without overwhelming evidence and institutional support that clearly didn't exist within the current command structure. Sarah documented every detail of Hayes's account, while providing emotional support and gathering intelligence about Reed's methods and the extent of his predatory behavior. The financial corruption had expanded beyond the initial contract irregularities Sarah had identified to include systematic theft of military resources through fraudulent inventory reporting and supply chain manipulation. Sergeant Major Patricia Wells, who managed base logistics operations, had been pressured to report equipment losses and maintenance requirements that justified ordering replacement supplies that were then diverted to Reed's personal use or sold to private parties. Wells was a 28-year veteran with an exemplary service record who had initially resisted participating in fraudulent activities but had been systematically intimidated through threats to her career and retirement benefits. Her cooperation had been secured through a combination of promised rewards for loyalty and explicit warnings about the consequences of refusing to support Reed's directives. Sergeant Major Wells submitted inventory reports showing significant losses of high-value equipment that required immediate replacement. Sarah documented during one of her secure communications with Lieutenant Colonel Morgan. However, physical inspection of the facilities reveals that most of the supposedly lost equipment is actually present and functional, suggesting the replacement orders were fraudulent justifications for acquiring additional supplies that are being diverted elsewhere. The investigation revealed that Reed had established relationships with civilian businesses that purchased military equipment and supplies through intermediaries who disguised the transactions as legitimate surplus sales or authorized transfers. The proceeds from these sales were flowing back to Reed through the same network of consulting agreements and investment opportunities that benefited him from the fraudulent contracts. Captain Ryan O'Connor, Sarah's workspace neighbor, had been unwillingly drawn into these activities through his role managing classified equipment inventories. O'Connor had been ordered to classify certain equipment losses as security-related incidents that required special handling procedures, which effectively removed them from standard accountability systems and made independent verification nearly impossible. "I've been documenting equipment transfers that don't match any operational requirements or authorized dispositions," O'Connor confided to Sarah during one of their conversations. "When I've asked for clarification about where this equipment is actually going and why the transfers aren't following standard procedures, I've been told that asking too many questions about classified operations shows poor judgment and could affect my security clearance status." The threats to personnel who raised questions about irregular activities weren't limited to career retaliation, but included explicit warnings about criminal prosecution for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Reed's organization had weaponized military security regulations to silence potential whistleblowers by suggesting that reporting irregular activities could itself constitute security violations that would result in court-martial and imprisonment. Staff Sergeant Monica Rivera had been investigating discrepancies in communications equipment allocations when she was suddenly subjected to a security investigation that questioned her handling of classified materials and her associations with civilian contractors. The investigation found no evidence of actual security violations, but the process had been psychologically devastating and had effectively ended her willingness to pursue questions about equipment accountability. The security investigation lasted 4 months and examined every aspect of my personal and professional life, Rivera had explained to Sarah during a conversation that revealed the sophisticated methods Reed's organization used to intimidate potential threats. Even though I was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, the process made clear that asking questions about operations I didn't understand could result in career-ending consequences. Sarah's analysis of personnel records revealed that Rivera's experience was part of a pattern where anyone who displayed curiosity about irregular activities was subjected to intensive scrutiny designed to discourage further inquiry. The investigations were always conducted through legitimate channels, with appropriate legal justification, but the timing and intensity suggested coordination intended to send clear messages about the risks of challenging command authority. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual intimidation to include systematic erosion of institutional norms and professional standards that had traditionally protected personnel from abuse. Reed had gradually implemented policies and procedures that isolated personnel from external oversight while creating dependency relationships that made resistance increasingly difficult. Mandatory social events and unit activities had been restructured to blur boundaries between professional and personal relationships, creating situations where refusing participation or expressing discomfort with inappropriate behavior could be characterized as poor unit cohesion or lack of commitment to team building. Personnel found themselves in environments where professional objections to misconduct were reframed as personal failures to support their colleagues and commanders. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson had been assigned to organize unit social events that increasingly involved activities designed to compromise participants and create mutual obligations that discouraged reporting misconduct. Johnson was deeply uncomfortable with his role, but felt trapped by explicit warnings that failing to successfully organize events that met Reed's expectations would result in negative evaluations and possible administrative action. "I'm supposed to coordinate unit activities that build morale and strengthen relationships," Johnson explained to Sarah. "But the events I'm being directed to organize seem designed to create situations where people compromise themselves or witness behavior that they're then expected to keep confidential. It feels like I'm being used to manufacture leverage against my own colleagues." The systematic nature of Reed's operation included careful selection and grooming of personnel who could be trusted to participate in or enable illegal activities. Junior officers and enlisted personnel were evaluated not just for professional competence, but for psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to secure cooperation. Those who displayed strong ethical principles or inclination to question authority were marginalized or transferred, while those who showed flexibility about regulations and loyalty to personal relationships were promoted and given increased responsibilities. Major Rebecca Torres exemplified this selection process, having been elevated to executive officer based partly on her demonstrated willingness to implement Reed's directives without questioning their propriety or legality. Torres had gradually been drawn into increasingly problematic activities through a progression of small compromises that eventually left her complicit in serious misconduct without clear opportunities to extract herself from the situation. Sarah's observation of Torres revealed someone who was intelligent enough to understand the legal and ethical problems with Reed's operation, but psychologically invested in the relationship and professionally dependent on Reed's continued favor. Torres's position made her both a crucial enabler of Reed's activities and a potential key witness whose cooperation could be essential for prosecution. The evidence Sarah had gathered by her second month painted a picture of institutional corruption that would require comprehensive investigation and prosecution to address effectively. The scope of misconduct and number of personnel involved meant that simple prosecution of Reed alone would be insufficient to restore integrity to Fort Meridian's operations or ensure accountability for all participants in the systematic abuse of authority and theft of resources. Her secure communications with Morgan emphasized the need for careful planning about how to proceed, without allowing destruction of evidence or intimidation of witnesses once the investigation became known. The success of eventual prosecutions would depend on simultaneous action against multiple participants and comprehensive protection for personnel who agreed to provide truthful testimony about their experiences and observations. As autumn deepened into winter at Fort Meridian, Sarah found herself trapped in an increasingly precarious situation where her investigation had uncovered corruption so extensive that any premature exposure could result in massive evidence destruction and witness intimidation. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan's superiors were demanding actionable results after 6 months of intensive undercover work, while the misconduct she observed daily was becoming more brazen and harmful to the personnel she'd grown to genuinely care about. The breaking point came during a base-wide readiness inspection, scheduled for early December, where external evaluators would review Fort Meridian's operational procedures and command effectiveness. Reed viewed the inspection as both an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership capabilities and a potential threat that could expose irregularities in his operations if not carefully managed. "This inspection represents everything we've worked to build here," Reed announced during a commander's meeting that Sarah attended, in her role supporting intelligence briefings for the evaluation team. "Our success depends on presenting a unified front and ensuring that external evaluators understand our operational excellence rather than getting distracted by minor procedural variations that might be misunderstood by people unfamiliar with our specific mission requirements." The language was carefully chosen to sound like standard preparation for military inspections, but Sarah recognized it as instructions for personnel to conceal irregular activities and present sanitized versions of actual operations. The meeting included detailed discussions about which records would be made available to inspectors, which personnel would be authorized to speak with evaluators, and how to handle any questions that might arise about sensitive or classified activities. Major Torres distributed briefing materials that provided talking points for personnel who might be interviewed during the inspection. The materials appeared to be routine guidance for presenting operations in the best possible light, but careful analysis revealed systematic instructions for avoiding topics or deflecting questions that might reveal problems within the command structure. Personnel should remember that external evaluators may not fully understand the operational requirements that drive our procedures, Torres explained to section leaders. "It's important to provide accurate information while ensuring that our responses focus on successful mission accomplishment rather than administrative complexities that might be misinterpreted as problems." Sarah recognized this as sophisticated obstruction of the inspection process, designed to prevent external oversight from discovering the corruption she'd been documenting. The inspection represented a critical moment where Reed's organization would either successfully deceive military oversight or face exposure that could trigger comprehensive investigation of their activities. The psychological pressure on personnel during this period was intense and increasingly visible. Lieutenant Christina Hayes had grown noticeably withdrawn and anxious as Reed's demands escalated in advance of the inspection. Hayes had confided to Sarah that Reed had explicitly connected her cooperation with his special projects to her performance evaluation during the inspection period. "He's made it very clear that my ability to demonstrate loyalty and discretion during the inspection will determine whether I receive recommendations for promotion and advanced training opportunities," Hayes explained, her voice reflecting the stress of someone trapped in an impossible situation. "I'm supposed to attend social events with visiting inspectors where I'll help ensure they have positive impressions of base operations and command effectiveness." Sarah understood that Hayes was being positioned to provide sexual favors or intimate companionship to inspection officials as part of Reed's strategy for managing external oversight. The suggestion was never made explicitly, but the implications were clear to anyone familiar with Reed's methods and Hayes's increasingly desperate situation. The financial irregularities that Sarah had been documenting were being hastily concealed through a complex series of accounting adjustments and document modifications designed to present legitimate appearances to external auditors. Captain James Bradford was working overtime to retroactively create paperwork that would justify irregular procurement activities and provide plausible explanations for budget discrepancies. "I'm being asked to generate documentation for contracts and expenditures that will satisfy auditor requirements," Bradford confided to Sarah during a conversation that revealed his growing desperation about his complicity in fraudulent activities. "The documents I'm creating aren't exactly false, but they're certainly designed to obscure rather than clarify how money was actually spent and why certain vendors received preferential treatment." Bradford's situation exemplified the psychological trap that Reed had created for personnel who'd been drawn into questionable activities. Refusing to participate in the cover-up would expose their previous cooperation with irregular procedures, but continuing to participate meant deeper complicity in systematic fraud that was becoming increasingly difficult to justify or conceal. Sarah's secure communications with Morgan during this period focused on the critical decision about whether to allow the inspection to proceed with Reed's deception or to trigger intervention that would expose the investigation prematurely. Morgan's analysis suggested that successful deception of the inspection team would embolden Reed to escalate his activities, while premature exposure might allow destruction of evidence and retaliation against witnesses. We're approaching a decision point where continued observation may become complicit in ongoing crimes, Morgan explained during one of their carefully orchestrated meetings. Your documentation has provided substantial evidence for prosecution, but we need to consider whether allowing additional misconduct to occur while building even stronger cases crosses ethical lines about protecting potential victims. The inspection team arrived at Fort Meridian on December 10th, consisting of senior officers from regional command with expertise in operations, administration, and command climate assessment. Their presence created visible tension throughout the base as personnel struggled to balance honest representation of their experiences with awareness that contradicting official narratives could result in severe retaliation. Colonel Margaret Foster led the inspection team with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd conducted dozens of similar evaluations at military installations throughout her career. Her experience included identifying signs of command dysfunction and institutional problems that commanders attempted to conceal through careful presentation and coached responses from subordinates. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of being interviewed by Colonel Foster while maintaining her cover identity and mission security. The interview represented a critical test of her ability to provide truthful information about command climate without compromising her investigation or exposing her real identity and purpose at Fort Meridian. Captain Mitchell, you've been assigned here for several months now, Foster had said during their formal interview. What's your assessment of command effectiveness and personnel morale within your section? Sarah's response required extraordinary care to provide accurate information about the problems she'd observed while avoiding statements that might alert Reed's organization to her investigative activities. She described concerns about communication patterns and decision-making processes using language that was truthful but could be interpreted as routine observations rather than systematic documentation of misconduct. I've observed some inconsistencies in how policies are implemented and communicated, Sarah replied carefully. Personnel seem uncertain about which procedures take precedence when there are conflicts between written regulations and verbal directives from supervisory personnel. The inspection proceeded over 3 days with Colonel Foster's team conducting interviews, reviewing documentation, and observing operational procedures. Sarah watched the process with growing frustration as Reed's organization successfully presented sanitized versions of their activities while concealing the systematic corruption and abuse that had characterized daily operations. Lieutenant Hayes performed her assigned role during social events with the inspection team, providing charming companionship that helped create positive impressions of base operations, while never explicitly crossing lines that could be characterized as inappropriate. Her performance was psychologically devastating but professionally effective in terms of Reed's objectives for managing external oversight. The financial records that Captain Bradford had hastily modified passed cursory review by the inspection team, whose expertise focused more on operational effectiveness than detailed accounting analysis. The documentation appeared sufficient to justify expenditures and procurement activities without revealing the underlying fraud and corruption that Sarah had spent months documenting. By the final day of the inspection, it became clear that Reed's organization had successfully deceived the external evaluators and would likely receive positive assessments that would strengthen Reed's position and provide additional cover for continuing his systematic abuse of authority and theft of resources. Sarah's communications with Morgan during this period emphasized the urgency of moving beyond observation to active intervention before Reed's success, with the inspection emboldened him to escalate activities that were already causing serious harm to multiple personnel. The investigation had gathered sufficient evidence for prosecution, and continued delay was becoming difficult to justify given the ongoing victimization she was witnessing. The inspection concluded with preliminary feedback that praised Fort Meridian's operational readiness and command effectiveness, providing Reed with exactly the external validation he'd sought to legitimize his leadership and deflect potential criticism of his methods. The success represented a significant victory for Reed's organization and a serious setback for accountability efforts. Sarah realized that the inspection's failure to detect obvious problems demonstrated the sophisticated nature of Reed's operation and the inadequacy of traditional oversight mechanisms for addressing systematic corruption that had been carefully designed to evade detection through standard military evaluation procedures. The December readiness inspection's successful conclusion marked a turning point that transformed Commander Reed from a cautious predator into someone who believed himself truly untouchable. The glowing preliminary report from Colonel Foster's evaluation team had validated his methods and provided institutional cover that emboldened him to abandon the careful restraint that had previously characterized his operations. Within days of the inspection team's departure, Reed convened a celebration dinner at the officers' club that ostensibly honored the base's successful evaluation, but actually served as a victory lap for his inner circle of collaborators. The event was mandatory for all senior personnel, creating a captive audience for Reed's increasingly grandiose speeches about leadership, loyalty, and the importance of maintaining unit cohesion above bureaucratic compliance. External validation confirms what we've always known about the effectiveness of our approach to military leadership, Reed announced during his remarks to the assembled officers. While other commands get bogged down in administrative details and procedural complications, we focus on mission accomplishment and taking care of our people. The inspection results prove that our methods produce superior outcomes. Sarah attended the dinner in her cover role, observing Reed's triumphant demeanor while documenting the attendance and reactions of personnel who'd been complicit in or victimized by his activities. The celebration felt more like a criminal organization congratulating itself on evading law enforcement than a military unit honoring legitimate achievements. Major Torres used her remarks at the dinner to reinforce the message about loyalty and discretion that had become central to maintaining Reed's operation. Her speech emphasized the importance of family loyalty within the unit and the dangers of allowing outsiders to misunderstand their successful but unconventional approaches to military leadership. We've built something special here that requires protection from people who might not understand the sacrifices and commitments necessary for true excellence, Torres declared, her words carrying clear warnings about the consequences of disloyalty disguised as inspirational leadership messaging. Our success depends on each member of this family understanding their role and responsibilities to the team. The dinner's social aspects provided Reed with opportunities to consolidate his control over personnel while identifying potential new targets for exploitation. Sarah observed him paying particular attention to newly assigned female officers while making subtle but unmistakable references to career opportunities that might be available to those who demonstrated appropriate appreciation for his mentorship. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, who'd recently arrived at Fort Meridian from a previous assignment, became the focus of Reed's attention during the evening. Walsh was 25, professionally ambitious and clearly uncomfortable with Reed's increasingly personal comments and unwanted physical contact during what should have been routine social interactions. Lieutenant Walsh represents exactly the kind of promising young officer who can benefit from the mentorship and guidance we provide here, Reed announced publicly while maintaining inappropriate physical contact that Walsh couldn't refuse without creating a scene. I look forward to working closely with her to ensure she receives all the opportunities and experiences necessary for career advancement. Sarah recognized the familiar pattern of public statements that established plausible professional justification for private interactions that would inevitably become increasingly inappropriate. Walsh's visible discomfort and trapped expression mirrored what Sarah had observed in Reed's previous victims, but the celebration atmosphere made intervention impossible without compromising her cover. The financial corruption that had been temporarily concealed during the inspection resumed immediately afterward with a boldness that reflected Reed's confidence in his institutional protection. New contracts were awarded to his preferred vendors without even the minimal competitive bidding procedures that had previously provided cover for the fraudulent arrangements. Captain Bradford was instructed to process emergency procurement requests totaling $1.8 million for critical operational requirements that appeared to have no legitimate military purpose. The requests were submitted with Reed's direct authorization, bypassing normal review procedures and creating obvious paper trails that would have been easily detected by competent auditors. These procurement requirements are classified at levels that prevent detailed discussion of operational necessities, Reed explained when Bradford expressed concerns about the lack of documentation and justification for the massive expenditures. Your job is to process the paperwork efficiently, rather than questioning directives that relate to missions you're not cleared to understand. The threat was clear. Questioning the fraudulent procurements would be characterized as security violations that could result in loss of clearance and career destruction. Bradford's compliance was secured through intimidation that weaponized military security regulations against personnel who might otherwise report obvious criminal activity. The harassment of female personnel escalated dramatically in the weeks following the inspection, with Reed apparently convinced that his institutional protection was sufficient to shield him from accountability, regardless of how egregious his behavior became. His interactions with Lieutenant Christina Hayes progressed from inappropriate mentoring to explicit sexual demands, disguised as career counseling sessions. Commander Reed has explained that my advancement opportunities depend on demonstrating complete loyalty and willingness to support unit cohesion through whatever means necessary, Hayes confided to Sarah during a conversation that revealed her desperate psychological state. He's made clear that refusing to participate in activities he considers essential for unit morale would demonstrate poor judgment and lack of commitment to team building. Sarah understood that Hayes was being coerced into providing sexual services to Reed and potentially to visitors or contractors whose relationships were important to Reed's operation. The psychological manipulation had progressed to explicit threats about career destruction disguised as professional guidance about loyalty and team commitment. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan's analysis of Sarah's reports during this period emphasized the urgency of moving toward intervention before Reed's escalating behavior caused irreparable harm to additional victims. The investigation had documented systematic criminal activity with overwhelming evidence, and continued delay was becoming difficult to justify given the accelerating pace of victimization. Reed's confidence following the inspection has eliminated the caution that previously limited his activities, Morgan observed during one of their secure communications. We're now documenting crimes in real time rather than investigating historical misconduct, which changes our ethical obligations about intervention timing. The decision to proceed with exposure was complicated by the need to coordinate with military prosecutors, protect witnesses from retaliation, and ensure that evidence collection was completed before Reed's organization could destroy documentation or intimidate personnel into silence. The operation required precise timing to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risks to victims and witnesses. Sarah's psychological state during this period was increasingly strained by the necessity of maintaining her cover while observing escalating criminal behavior that demanded immediate intervention. Her training had prepared her for the operational challenges of undercover work, but watching colleagues suffer abuse while building cases for eventual prosecution created moral stress that affected her sleep, concentration, and emotional stability. Dr. Catherine Phillips, the base psychologist, had noticed changes in personnel behavior that suggested widespread stress and trauma related to command climate issues. Phillips couldn't address specific cases without compromising professional ethics, but her aggregate observations about psychological distress patterns provided additional evidence of institutional problems that corroborated Sarah's investigative findings. The upcoming holiday party scheduled for December 20th represented a critical juncture where Reed planned to escalate his exploitation of female personnel while celebrating another successful year of evading accountability. The event was structured as a mandatory unit celebration, but Sarah's intelligence suggested it would actually serve as cover for activities that would constitute serious criminal violations under both military and civilian law. Sarah's communications with Morgan during this period focused on finalizing plans for exposure that would occur immediately after the holiday party, allowing documentation of Reed's most egregious crimes while ensuring that intervention occurred before additional victims could be seriously harmed. The timing would require coordination with military prosecutors, regional command, and law enforcement agencies to ensure comprehensive response to the criminal enterprise that Reed had established. The mounting pressure of maintaining her cover while preparing for the investigation's conclusion created psychological stress that tested Sarah's training and resilience. She found herself counting days until the operation would end, while simultaneously dreading the confrontation that would inevitably expose her deception to colleagues she'd grown to genuinely care about, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Reed's increasing recklessness and confidence suggested that the December 20th holiday party would provide the final evidence necessary to ensure comprehensive prosecution of his criminal organization, but it also meant that Sarah would need to maintain her cover for several more weeks while witnessing behavior that challenged every principle she'd sworn to uphold as a military officer. The December 20th holiday party at Fort Meridian's Officers Club was scheduled as the culminating event of what Reed considered his most successful year of command. But Sarah knew it would actually serve as the final act of a criminal enterprise that was about to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance and brutality. The investigation had reached the point where every additional day of observation was purchased with the suffering of personnel who deserved protection rather than documentation. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan had coordinated with military prosecutors and regional command to establish intervention protocols that would activate immediately following the party. allowing Reed's organization to expose themselves through their most egregious criminal behavior while ensuring that comprehensive arrests and evidence seizures occurred before retaliation or destruction of documentation became possible. We'll have teams positioned to simultaneously arrest Reed and his primary collaborators while securing all financial records, personnel files, and electronic communications, Morgan had explained during Sarah's final briefing before the operation concluded. Your role is to document whatever occurs during the party while maintaining your cover until the arrest teams arrive. Under no circumstances should you intervene directly unless you face immediate physical danger. The party preparations revealed the extent to which Reed's operation had corrupted normal military social events into opportunities for criminal activity. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh had been assigned special duties that involved providing entertainment for visiting contractors whose business relationships were essential to Reed's financial schemes. The assignment was presented as routine hostess responsibilities, but the implications were unmistakably sexual in nature. Commander Reed has emphasized the importance of ensuring our guests feel properly welcomed and appreciated, Major Torres had explained to Walsh during preparation meetings that Sarah observed. Your role involves making sure that important visitors understand the quality of hospitality and personal attention they can expect when doing business with Fort Meridian. Walsh's expression during these briefings reflected the psychological trauma of someone being systematically groomed for sexual exploitation while being unable to resist without destroying her military career. Sarah documented every aspect of the preparation while struggling with the moral burden of allowing the crime to proceed in order to gather evidence for prosecution. The financial aspects of the party involved expenditures that clearly constituted theft of military resources for personal entertainment and business development. Captain Bradford had been ordered to process invoices totaling $47,000 for catering, entertainment, and decorations that exceeded any reasonable budget for military social events and included services that appeared designed to facilitate criminal activities. The holiday party represents an investment in relationships that support our operational effectiveness, Reed had announced during staff meetings where the excessive spending was discussed. Building strong partnerships with civilian contractors and regional business leaders requires demonstrating the quality of leadership and hospitality that characterizes successful military commands. The rationalizations were increasingly transparent attempts to justify systematic theft and corruption, but Reed's confidence in his institutional protection had eliminated even minimal efforts to conceal criminal intent. Sarah's documentation of these statements would provide crucial evidence of deliberate fraud rather than administrative errors or poor judgment. The party began at 1800 hours on December 20th with an attendance that included not only Fort Meridian personnel, but also civilian contractors, local business leaders, and regional political figures whose relationships with Reed involved various forms of mutual corruption and influence peddling. The guest list read like a directory of everyone who'd benefited from or enabled Reed's criminal activities over the past 4 years. Reed's opening remarks to the assembled guests celebrated what he described as the most successful year in Fort Meridian's history, emphasizing operational achievements that were actually products of systematic fraud and resource theft. His speech included barely coded references to the loyalty and discretion that had made their unconventional approaches to military leadership so effective. We've built partnerships and achieved results that demonstrate what's possible when talented people work together without being constrained by bureaucratic limitations or excessive oversight, Reed announced to enthusiastic applause from guests who understood exactly what those euphemisms meant in terms of their own financial benefits and protected criminal activities. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe and document the interactions between Reed's organization and their civilian collaborators while maintaining her cover as a junior intelligence officer attending a routine social event. The conversations she overheard provided final confirmation of the systematic nature of the corruption and the extent of civilian involvement in military contract fraud. Marcus Thompson from Meridian Solutions LLC was present with his wife, openly discussing future contract opportunities and expressing gratitude for Reed's continued support in securing lucrative military business. The conversation included explicit references to financial arrangements and shared profits that constituted clear evidence of criminal conspiracy. Our partnership has been mutually beneficial in ways that demonstrate the value of long-term relationships built on trust and shared objectives, Thompson told Reed during a conversation Sarah recorded. We look forward to continuing these arrangements and exploring additional opportunities for collaboration that serve everyone's interests. The evening's entertainment included activities that progressively revealed the sexual exploitation that had become routine within Reed's operation. Young female Marines were assigned to provide personal attention to male guests in ways that clearly violated military regulations and potentially civilian laws regarding sexual coercion and trafficking. Lieutenant Christina Hayes was observed being directed to accompany a civilian contractor to a private area of the club where their interaction involved obvious sexual contact that Hayes had no realistic ability to refuse without facing career-ending retaliation. Sarah documented the incident while experiencing psychological distress that tested her ability to maintain operational discipline. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh's assigned duties escalated throughout the evening, from serving drinks and engaging in conversation to providing intimate companionship that constituted sexual services in exchange for continued business relationships between the contractors and Reed's organization. The progression was carefully managed to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring that the criminal objectives were accomplished. The financial transactions that occurred during the party included explicit discussions about kickback arrangements, contract steering, and revenue sharing that would have provided overwhelming evidence for prosecution even without the months of documentation Sarah had already gathered. Reed's organization had become so confident in their protection that they were conducting criminal conspiracies in full view of dozens of witnesses. Our accounting arrangements have worked well for everyone involved, Reed told a group of contractors during a conversation Sarah observed. The premium pricing for your services reflects the value we place on reliability and discretion, and I trust those premiums continue to find their way to appropriate appreciation accounts. The language was carefully crafted to provide minimal legal exposure while making the criminal arrangements unmistakably clear to participants. Sarah's documentation included audio recordings that would make prosecution straightforward regardless of how defense attorneys attempted to characterize the conversations. The party's climax occurred around 2200 hours when Reed gathered his inner circle for what he described as a private toast to their continued success and mutual loyalty. The gathering included Major Torres, Captain Bradford, Sergeant Major Wells, and several civilian contractors whose criminal relationships with Reed had generated millions in fraudulent profits over the past 4 years, to partnerships that transcend conventional limitations and friendships that provide mutual protection regardless of external pressures, Reed announced during the toast that Sarah recorded. Our success depends on maintaining the discretion and loyalty that have brought us this far, and I'm confident those qualities will continue to serve us well in the future. The toast represented a criminal conspiracy, celebrating their successful evasion of accountability while pledging continued criminal activity, providing exactly the kind of evidence prosecutors needed to demonstrate ongoing criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or administrative irregularities. Sarah's secure communication device activated at 20:47 hours with a single coded message that meant arrest teams were moving into position around Fort Meridian. Her 8-month investigation was about to conclude, with comprehensive arrests and evidence seizures that would expose the full scope of Reed's criminal organization and ensure accountability for everyone who'd participated in or enabled the systematic corruption. The transition from observation to arrest operation required Sarah to maintain her cover for several more minutes while military police and federal agents surrounded the officers' club and prepared to simultaneously arrest multiple targets without allowing coordination or evidence destruction. Her role was ending, but the most dangerous phase of the operation was about to begin. The arrest operation commenced at exactly 2300 hours, with military police and federal agents simultaneously moving on 12 different locations throughout Fort Meridian, executing search warrants and apprehension orders that had been meticulously planned to prevent coordination between Reed's criminal organization and minimize opportunities for evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Sarah remained in the officers' club, maintaining her cover identity while observing the initial confusion and panic that erupted when heavily armed federal agents burst through the main entrance and began announcing arrests. The sudden transition from celebration to criminal apprehension created chaos that revealed the psychological fragility underlying Reed's apparently confident criminal enterprise. "Nobody move! Federal agents, this is a lawful arrest operation," Special Agent Patricia Coleman announced as her team spread throughout the club, weapons drawn and arrest warrants ready. "Commander Jackson Reed, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of government property, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to remain silent." Reed's reaction to the arrests revealed the complete collapse of the commanding presence he'd cultivated throughout his criminal career. His face went pale, his hands began shaking, and his voice cracked as he attempted to maintain authority in a situation where his institutional protection had evaporated instantly. "There's been some kind of mistake," Reed stammered, his words lacking any conviction as agents secured his hands behind his back with federal restraints. "I demand to speak with my attorney and regional command immediately. This is completely inappropriate treatment of a senior military officer." Major Torres was arrested simultaneously by a second team of agents who'd positioned themselves near her location before the operation began. Her response was more controlled than Reed's, but her expression showed the shock of someone who'd believed their careful planning had made arrest impossible. "Major Rebecca Torres, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and accessory to theft of government property," Agent Coleman announced while Torres was restrained. "You will be transported to federal detention facility, pending arraignment on criminal charges." Captain Bradford's arrest occurred in the club's side room where he'd been attempting to use his phone, presumably to warn other participants in Reed's organization about the law enforcement activity. His apprehension prevented communication that might have allowed destruction of evidence or coordination of legal defenses among the criminal conspirators. The civilian contractors present at the party were also arrested as part of the coordinated operation, with federal agents executing warrants that charged them with conspiracy to defraud the United States government and violation of federal contracting regulations. Their arrest eliminated the external support network that had enabled Reed's criminal activities while securing crucial witnesses for prosecution. Marcus Thompson from Meridian Solutions LLC was arrested while attempting to leave through a rear exit, suggesting awareness that his business relationships with Reed constituted criminal activity that warranted flight rather than explanation. His apprehension included seizure of financial records and electronic devices that would provide evidence about the scope of fraudulent contracts. Mr. Thompson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government and money laundering, federal agents announced while securing Thompson and his companions. Your business activities with Fort Meridian are subject to federal investigation for criminal violations of government contracting regulations. Sergeant Major Patricia Wells was arrested at her quarters while apparently attempting to destroy paperwork related to fraudulent inventory reports and equipment transfers. The timing of her document destruction provided additional evidence of criminal consciousness and coordination within Reed's organization. Sarah maintained her position in the main area of the officers' club, observing the arrests while documenting personnel reactions and ensuring that her cover remained intact until Lieutenant Colonel Morgan could safely extract her from the operation. Her role required appearing as shocked and confused as other legitimate personnel who were witnessing the collapse of their command structure. Lieutenant Christina Hayes was among the personnel questioned but not arrested, as investigators recognized her status as victim rather than participant in Reed's criminal activities. Her visible relief at Reed's apprehension confirmed Sarah's assessment that Hayes had been coerced into participation rather than willingly collaborating with criminal activities. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh similarly showed psychological relief that suggested her involvement had been coerced rather than voluntary. Both women would require extensive counseling and support to recover from their exploitation, but their status as victims rather than criminals had been clearly established through Sarah's documentation of the coercion and threats they'd experienced. The evidence seizures that occurred simultaneously with the arrests included comprehensive confiscation of financial records, computer systems, communication devices, and personal property that had been purchased with proceeds from fraudulent activities. The scope of seizures reflected months of careful planning based on Sarah's intelligence about the location and nature of evidence. Building 7, where Sarah had worked in her cover identity, was completely secured by federal agents who seized computer systems, filing cabinets, and safes containing classified materials that documented the financial fraud and contract manipulation. The thoroughness of the seizures ensured that Reed's organization couldn't destroy evidence or claim that missing documentation prevented fair prosecution. Reed's personal quarters were searched simultaneously, yielding bank records, investment documents, and communication records that provided direct evidence of his receipt of proceeds from fraudulent contracts. The search also uncovered personal property that had clearly been purchased with stolen military funds, including expensive electronics and jewelry that exceeded what Reed could afford on his military salary. The homes of civilian contractors involved in the conspiracy were also searched as part of the coordinated operation, yielding evidence about the corporate structures used to disguise criminal transactions and the methods used to transfer proceeds from fraudulent contracts to personal accounts controlled by Reed and his collaborators. Sarah's extraction from the scene occurred at 1:30 hours when Lieutenant Colonel Morgan arrived at the officers' club with credentials identifying him as the lead investigator responsible for coordinating the arrests. His presence provided cover for Sarah's departure while maintaining operational security about her role in the investigation. Captain Mitchell, you'll need to come with me for debriefing about intelligence matters that may relate to this investigation, Morgan announced publicly, providing plausible explanation for Sarah's removal from the scene without revealing her undercover status to personnel who weren't involved in criminal activities. The transport to Morgan's temporary command center provided Sarah's first opportunity in 8 months to speak openly about her experiences and observations without maintaining cover identity. The psychological relief of ending sustained deception was overwhelming, but was tempered by exhaustion and stress from witnessing months of criminal behavior and victim exploitation. "Your work provided the foundation for everything that happened tonight," Morgan told Sarah during their initial debriefing session. "Without your documentation and intelligence, we never could have built cases strong enough to justify this operation or gathered evidence sufficient to ensure convictions on serious charges." The preliminary casualty assessment indicated that Reed's criminal organization had been completely dismantled through the coordinated arrests, with all primary participants in custody and comprehensive evidence secured for prosecution. The success of the operation exceeded what investigators had hoped for when Sarah's assignment began 8 months earlier. Regional Command initiated immediate leadership changes at Fort Meridian to ensure continuity of operations while criminal proceedings developed. Interim commanders were appointed from outside Reed's sphere of influence, and comprehensive reviews of all administrative and operational procedures were ordered to identify and correct the institutional failures that had enabled systematic corruption. The media attention generated by the arrests was intense, but carefully managed to protect operational security and ensure that publicity didn't compromise ongoing investigations or legal proceedings. Military public affairs officials emphasized institutional commitment to accountability while avoiding statements that might prejudice eventual trials. Sarah's role in the investigation remained classified to protect both her safety and her ability to participate in similar operations in the future. Her identity as the undercover investigator who'd exposed Reed's criminal organization would be closely guarded until prosecution concluded and threat assessments confirmed her safety. The 8-month investigation had concluded with comprehensive success that would serve as a model for future operations against military corruption, but the personal cost to Sarah and the victims of Reed's organization would require extensive time and resources to address through counseling and institutional reform. The aftermath of Reed's arrest operation transformed Fort Meridian from a criminal enterprise disguised as a military installation into a model for institutional accountability and reform that would influence military justice procedures throughout the armed services. The comprehensive nature of the evidence gathered during Sarah's 8-month investigation ensured that prosecution proceeded swiftly and resulted in convictions that sent clear messages about the consequences of systematic corruption and abuse of authority. Commander Jackson Reed's court-martial concluded 6 months after his arrest, with convictions on 17 separate charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of government property, sexual assault, witness intimidation, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The military judge sentenced Reed to 22 years in federal prison, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and restitution of $4.7 million in stolen government funds. Colonel Reed's systematic abuse of command authority represents the antithesis of military values and leadership principles, Judge Colonel Harrison stated during sentencing. His actions damaged not only the immediate victims of his crimes, but the institutional integrity that serves as the foundation of military effectiveness and public trust. This sentence reflects the severity of his betrayal and the military's commitment to accountability at all levels of leadership. Major Rebecca Torres received a sentence of 12 years imprisonment after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges and agreeing to provide testimony against other participants in Reed's criminal organization. Her cooperation proved crucial for understanding the administrative mechanisms that had enabled systematic fraud and witness intimidation over multiple years. Captain James Bradford's sentence of 8 years reflected both his significant role in facilitating financial fraud and his eventual cooperation with investigators once the criminal enterprise was exposed. His detailed testimony about procurement manipulation and document falsification provided evidence that ensured convictions against civilian contractors who had participated in the conspiracy. The civilian contractors involved in the fraudulent contracting schemes received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, with Marcus Thompson of Meridian Solutions, LLC, receiving the maximum sentence due to his role as the primary coordinator of the kickback arrangements that had generated millions in illegal profits for Reed's organization. Sergeant Major Patricia Wells received a sentence of 6 years after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges, but her cooperation in explaining the inventory manipulation and equipment theft schemes resulted in recovery of substantial military property that had been diverted to civilian markets through Reed's criminal network. The institutional reforms implemented at Fort Meridian in response to the investigation became templates for policy changes throughout the military services. New oversight procedures included mandatory rotation of personnel in sensitive positions, enhanced financial auditing of procurement activities, anonymous reporting systems for command climate concerns, and external review of all major personnel actions affecting individuals who had filed complaints. Lieutenant Colonel David Morgan was promoted to full colonel and assigned to lead the newly created Military Integrity Office, which was established to coordinate investigation of systematic corruption and implement prevention programs based on lessons learned from operations like Sarah's investigation at Fort Meridian. Captain Mitchell's work demonstrated both the necessity and effectiveness of sophisticated undercover operations for addressing corruption that traditional oversight mechanisms failed to detect. Morgan explained during congressional testimony about military justice reform. Her investigation provided a roadmap for institutional change that extends far beyond individual prosecution to systemic improvement. Sarah's transition from undercover operations to training and institutional development roles reflected both personal growth and organizational recognition of her unique expertise in military investigation. Her assignment to the Defense Intelligence Training Center allowed her to develop curriculum for future investigators while processing the psychological impact of her 8-month deep cover assignment. The counseling and psychological support that Sarah received emphasized the importance of integrating her undercover experience without allowing it to define her entire identity or career trajectory. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who specialized in supporting personnel who'd completed high-stress assignments, helped Sarah understand the normal psychological reactions to sustained deception and witness to criminal behavior. Your work required extraordinary personal sacrifice and psychological resilience, Dr. Warren explained during their sessions. Processing these experiences in healthy ways is essential not just for your personal well-being, but for your continued effectiveness in roles that serve institutional integrity and justice. The victims of Reed's criminal organization received comprehensive support, including counseling, legal assistance, and career protection that ensured their cooperation with prosecution didn't result in professional retaliation. Lieutenant Christina Hayes and Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh both received assignments that allowed them to rebuild their careers away from the trauma they'd experienced at Fort Meridian. Hayes eventually became an advocate for military sexual assault prevention, using her experience to improve support systems for personnel facing similar exploitation. Her testimony during congressional hearings about military justice reform provided compelling evidence for policy changes that strengthened protection for victims and witnesses. Walsh transferred to a different service branch where she could pursue her military career without constant reminders of her victimization, but she maintained contact with support networks that helped other personnel facing similar challenges. Her recovery demonstrated the possibility of rebuilding professional and personal life after experiencing systematic exploitation and coercion. The financial recovery efforts resulted in restitution of approximately $3.8 million in stolen government funds and property, though some assets had been dissipated through legitimate expenditures or hidden in offshore accounts that required extended investigation to locate and recover. The recovered funds were used partly to improve facilities and programs at Fort Meridian and other installations. The media coverage of Reed's prosecution and the institutional reforms that followed generated significant public interest in military accountability and transparency. Sarah's role as the undercover investigator remained classified for security reasons, but the success of the operation encouraged similar investigations at other installations where corruption was suspected. Congressional oversight committees used the Fort Meridian case as a foundation for military justice reform legislation that expanded investigative resources, enhanced protection for whistleblowers, and mandated external oversight of installations where command climate problems had been identified. The reforms represented the most significant changes to military accountability procedures in decades. Sarah's long-term career development included advanced education in organizational psychology and institutional reform, preparing her for senior leadership roles where her understanding of both investigative techniques and institutional dysfunction could inform policy development and implementation at the highest levels of military leadership. The Fort Meridian investigation became a case study taught at military academies and staff colleges, demonstrating both the methods used to expose systematic corruption and the institutional changes necessary to prevent similar problems in the future. Sarah occasionally guest lectured at these institutions, sharing insights about undercover investigation while protecting operational details that remained classified. 5 years after Reed's arrest, Fort Meridian had been transformed into one of the most transparent and accountable installations in the military, with command climate assessments consistently rating it among the top facilities for personnel satisfaction and institutional integrity. The transformation demonstrated that comprehensive reform was possible even after extensive corruption had contaminated institutional culture. Sarah's reflection on her experience emphasized both the personal costs and institutional benefits of her 8-month assignment. The psychological toll of sustained deception and witness to systematic criminal behavior had been substantial, but the successful prosecution and institutional reform that resulted provided meaningful validation of the sacrifices required. Military institutions are only as strong as their commitment to the values they claim to represent, Sarah wrote in her final report about the investigation. Corruption and abuse of authority damage not just immediate victims, but the institutional integrity that serves as the foundation for military effectiveness and public trust. Accountability requires both individual courage and institutional systems that support rather than punish those who speak truth to power. The legacy of Sarah's investigation extended beyond individual prosecutions to lasting changes in how military institutions address corruption, support victims, and maintain accountability at all levels of leadership. Her work demonstrated that even sophisticated criminal organizations could be exposed and dismantled through careful investigation, comprehensive evidence gathering, and institutional commitment to justice over reputation protection. The 8 months Sarah spent as Captain Sarah Mitchell at Fort Meridian had concluded with transformative success that served military institutions and American democracy through renewed commitment to the values and accountability that effective military leadership requires. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.